Imagine trying to impress your crush, but you're not allowed to hold eye contact. You can't compliment her face, and your best romantic option is a freshly killed animal. That's medieval dating. No apps, no texts. Just pork fat, love potions, and a lot of very bad ideas. So before we dive into the strangest courtship rules from the Middle Ages, hit that like button and subscribe if you're ready to feel better about your own dating life. Now, real quick, would you rather receive a love poem or a dead rabbit? Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see why neither one worked. You think modern dating is nerve-wracking? Try locking eyes with someone in the Middle Ages. Today, a held gaze says, "I'm interested." Back then it said, "I'm either marrying you, fighting your father, or paying a fine." Medieval courtship began with the eyes, but not the way you'd hope. A glance that lasted too long could be interpreted as a legally binding promise. Seriously. There are recorded cases where a man simply looked at a woman for a few extra heartbeats, and her family demanded a wedding. No conversation, no courtship, just eye contact as a contract. So naturally, dating manuals of the time tried to help. They advised men to cultivate what they called a soft, sincere gaze. Sounds nice, right? Except no one could agree on what that meant. Too soft, and she'd think you were timid, or worse, uninterested. Too sincere, and you were practically begging for a duel with her brother. The ideal stare, according to one 13th century guide, was somewhere between "I admire your embroidery" and "I am not planning to invade your estate." That's a very narrow window. And here's where it gets tense. Because eye contact wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. The church taught that prolonged gazing opened the soul to temptation. A wandering eye could lead to lust, and lust could lead to confession, penance, or public shame. So when a man and woman accidentally locked eyes across a banquet hall, the air would thicken. Everyone noticed. You could feel the heat rise. She might blush, which, by the way, was also suspicious. Blushing could mean attraction, but it could also mean fever, plague, or that she'd had too much mead. Either way, the man was expected to look away immediately, cross himself, and pretend nothing happened. But the damage was done. That single glance, that half-second of mutual recognition, had already planted something. A question, a possibility, a secret that neither of them could speak aloud. Because here's the unspoken truth of medieval romance. Eye contact was the only honest thing you had. You couldn't touch. You couldn't speak freely. You couldn't even smile too wide without raising suspicion. But your eyes? They betrayed you. A lingering look from across a crowded room said everything words couldn't. I see you. I want you. I'm willing to risk scandal just to hold your gaze for one more breath. That's why the rules were so strict. The church, the family, the neighbors, they all knew that a single look could undo years of arranged marriages and careful politicking. So they tried to police the eyes. But desire has never been good at following rules. In the end, most medieval romances started not with a kiss, but with a stolen glance. A moment of eye contact that lasted just long enough to feel forbidden. And then, the look away, the flushed cheeks, the quiet walk home. That was the dance. That was the danger. And if you were lucky, she'd glance back, just once, just before disappearing into the crowd. That's all it took to change everything. But even if you mastered the stare, you still had to survive the next challenge. How to smell appealing when bathing was optional and deodorant didn't exist. Because nothing kills a romantic glance like body odor. Because nothing kills a romantic glance like body odor. And in the Middle Ages, body odor wasn't a problem. It was a fact of life. Most people bathed a few times a year, if that. Soap was rare. Deodorant didn't exist. And yet, medieval men and women still wanted to attract each other. So they did something that sounds ridiculous, but was completely serious. They weaponized their herb gardens. The logic was simple. If you couldn't wash away the smell, you'd cover it up with something stronger. Men would tuck sprigs of rosemary, sage, or lavender into their sleeves, their boots, even their belts. Every time they walked past a woman, they'd leave behind a trail of what they hoped was floral mystery. Did it mask the scent of sweat, leather, and last week's stew? Not really, but it showed effort. And in a world where most men smelled like barn animals, effort was half the battle. A young woman might catch a whiff of rosemary as a man passed, and for just a moment she'd wonder, is that for me? Wealthier suitors took it further. They carried a pomander, a small, hollow ball filled with crushed spices, worn on a chain around the neck or dangling from a belt. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, even dried orange peel. The pomander swung dramatically as you walked, releasing tiny bursts of fragrance with every step. It was the medieval equivalent of expensive cologne, and it sent a very clear message. I have money, I care about how I smell, and I'm trying very hard to impress you. Ladies, of course, noticed. They'd lean in just a little closer during a dance, or stand a bit nearer during church. The scent became an invitation, a silent question hanging in the air between them. But the truly bold, the ones who wanted more than just a passing whiff, they rubbed herbs directly onto their skin. Basil for boldness, mint for freshness. One 14th century love text actually claimed that thyme rubbed on the chest makes the heart visible. You have to wonder what that means. Was it symbolic? Or did some desperate suitor actually believe that a woman could see his heart beating through his skin if he used enough thyme? Either way, someone tried it. Imagine the tension of a first touch, a hand brushing against a cheek that smells faintly of crushed rosemary and hope. That was medieval seduction, raw, herbal, and surprisingly intimate. Of course, not all smells were welcome. Garlic was common, but it sent mixed signals. It showed you were healthy, yes, but it also made you smell like someone who wrestled pigs for a living. And if your breath carried the scent of beer and pickled fish, that wasn't romantic failure. That was just Tuesday. Still, the herb strategy worked often enough that apothecaries began selling love salves, secret recipes that were mostly just mashed up garden clippings sold at a premium. Side effects included sneezing and, in some cases, attracting goats. But even with the perfect herbal scent, you still couldn't say what you really wanted. So the next step was even stranger. You had to write a love poem that compared your beloved to the Virgin Mary, without sounding like you were applying to a monastery. And that's where things got truly complicated. Because after you'd mastered the stare and perfected your herbal scent, you still had to open your mouth, or rather, put quill to parchment. In medieval Europe, telling someone "I like you" wasn't romantic. It was reckless. Direct flirtation could lead to scandal, excommunication, or a very awkward conversation with her father's sword. So instead, you wrote a poem. But not just any poem. You couldn't praise her beauty. You couldn't mention her lips or her hair. That was too worldly, too sinful. Instead, you compared her to the Virgin Mary. Yes, the most acceptable way to express romantic interest in the Middle Ages was to tell a woman she reminded you of the Holy Mother of God. Nothing says, "I want to court you," like your virtue shines brighter than a baptismal font. These poems were dripping with religious imagery, angels, saints, divine light. They were so pious that you couldn't tell if the writer was proposing marriage or applying for priesthood. One famous verse from the 13th century called a woman "my angel of chaste delight." Imagine receiving that text today. You'd block the number. But here's the secret tension hiding beneath all that holiness. Everyone knew what the poems really meant. The religious language was a shield, a way to say, "I desire you," without saying it. A man would write about her purity, her grace, her heavenly aura, and she'd read between the lines. She'd feel the heat behind the cold Latin phrases. That was the game. You wrapped your longing in scripture, and if anyone accused you of impropriety, you could simply claim you were praising God's creation. It was plausible deniability wrapped in rhyme. And if you had money, you didn't write the poem yourself. You hired a troubadour, a professional poet who specialized in walking that fine line between romantic and legally deniable. These bards would craft verses that praised a woman's soul, her moral character, her ability to inspire noble thoughts. They'd make sure to avoid any mention of her body, her smile, or the way her dress clung to her hips. But the voice, the music, the way the singer lingered on certain words. That's where the real message lived. A skilled troubadour could make "I admire your virtue" sound like a confession of forbidden love. Women weren't silent in this game. Some wrote back, though their poetry tended to be slightly more honest. They'd praise a man's courage, his manners, and, most importantly, his land. Because marriage was a transaction, and everyone knew it. So the poems became a dance. He writes about her soul. She writes about his estate. And underneath all that careful wording, both of them are thinking the same thing. Is this going to work? Can we stand each other? Will our families approve? The poetry was never about poetry. It was about testing the waters without drowning. Of course, not every love letter succeeded. One particularly overzealous suitor sent a 40-stanza epic comparing his beloved to a cathedral. She replied with a single line, "I prefer monks." Another wrote a sonnet so religious that the local priest tried to recruit him into the clergy. But when it worked, when the poem landed just right, something shifted. A glance would linger a moment longer. A hand would brush against a sleeve. The religious words had done their job. They'd opened a door without breaking any rules. But even the perfect poem wasn't enough. Because next, you had to deliver it in a way that screamed romance without screaming sin. And that meant one thing: scented parchment. Because nothing says "I love you" like a letter that smells like cinnamon and desperation. Because nothing says "I love you" like a letter that smells like cinnamon and desperation. But even the most fragrant, theologically sound poem couldn't compete with the ultimate medieval love language, the gift of a dead animal. You read that correctly. While you might bring flowers or chocolates to a first date, a 14th century suitor showed up with a freshly slain boar's head, still steaming, or a skinned rabbit laid delicately on a silver platter. And this wasn't considered strange. It was considered romantic. Think about the psychology behind it. A knight or nobleman wanted to prove three things: bravery, skill, and devotion. What better way than to present the spoils of a hunt? A successful kill meant you could handle a weapon, you weren't afraid of blood, and you were willing to get your hands dirty, all attractive qualities in a society where danger lurked in every forest. So when a man walked into the village square holding a dead deer by its antlers, women took notice, not because they loved gore, but because that carcass represented survival. It said, "I can feed you, I can protect you, and I thought about you while I was up to my elbows in gutsit." The tension in that moment was electric. Imagine a young woman, dressed in her finest wool, standing by the well. A suitor approaches. He doesn't speak. He simply lays a dead pheasant at her feet. Her family watches from the doorway. The neighbors peer through shutters. She has to respond, but how? If she acts disgusted, she insults his manhood. If she acts too eager, she risks seeming immodest. So she learns to perform the perfect balance. A gasp of admiration, a soft thank you, and a silent prayer that he doesn't bring another one tomorrow. That was the dance of medieval gift-giving. Every hare, every swan, every hedgehog, yes, hedgehogs were a thing, carried a hidden message. A swan meant purity and grace, assuming it hadn't bitten anyone during capture. A falcon meant high status, though it required constant feeding and occasionally bit your fingers off. A boar's head? That was the big leagues. That meant, I am willing to risk death for the chance to impress you. Of course, not every man could afford a full deer or a trained falcon. The less wealthy resorted to smaller prey, rabbits, doves, or the ever-popular duck. One lovesick baker from a 13th century record gifted a duck to a miller's daughter. He'd tied a ribbon around its neck and presented it with a bow. The duck, however, had other plans. It escaped mid-courtship, splashed into the family's well, and refused to come out. The daughter laughed. The baker turned red. The relationship did not prosper. But that duck became local legend, proof that even the most well-intentioned gift could go horribly wrong. And yet, the most dangerous gift of all was the one you couldn't refuse, the ceremonial deer presentation. This was a lavish ritual, where a knight would have a whole roasted deer carried into a banquet hall on a massive platter, accompanied by musicians, poets, and 50 relatives pretending this was perfectly normal. The Lady of Honor had to accept it graciously, even if the sight of roasted meat made her stomach turn. Rejection would shame the knight and possibly start a feud, so she smiled. She nodded. She let the servants carve the beast, and later, in private, she'd whisper to her mother, "Does he really think I want another deer?" But the mother would just shrug, because in medieval romance, a dead animal said more than 1,000 poems ever could. It said, "I braved the forest, I risked infection, and I want you to know that I'm willing to kill for your attention." But what if you couldn't hunt? What if you were a baker, not a knight? Or worse, what if the woman you desired was already being courted by a richer, stronger man? Then you needed something far more desperate than a dead animal. You needed magic. And that's where the love potions came in. Brews so strange and so risky that they could either win her heart or get you burned as a witch. And that's where the love potions came in. Brews so strange and so risky that they could either win her heart or get you burned as a witch. For the desperate medieval suitor, the local apothecary or village-wise woman offered a dangerous shortcut. Why spend months writing poems and hunting deer when you could simply slip something into a drink? The logic was seductive, but the reality was terrifying. Love potions weren't romantic. They were a gamble with your soul. Let's start with the recipes. They were never simple. One popular concoction called for honey, basil, and powdered deer heart, because nothing says "I want you" like organ dust. Another mixed rose petals, cinnamon, and wine with something alarming: ashes of burnt hair. Your own hair? Her hair? The recipe didn't specify, which tells you everything about medieval pharmacology. A third required you to bury a special brew under her doorstep at midnight while whispering a chant. Imagine crouching in the mud, heart pounding, praying her father doesn't open the window with a crossbow. That was the reality of potion making. But the truly desperate, the ones who'd read too many forbidden manuscripts, went further. There are surviving texts that list ingredients like graveyard dirt, boiled fingernails, and even the fat of a black cat. You had to boil it, strain it, and mix it into a loaf of bread. Then you'd offer that bread to your beloved with a straight face. "Oh, this? Just a normal pastry. Definitely not containing cat fat and cemetery dust. Please eat it and fall madly in love with me." The tension in that moment must have been unbearable. She takes a bite. You hold your breath. Does she smile? Does she cough? Does she call for the priest? Of course, most potions didn't work. They made people dizzy, nauseous, or strangely prone to writing poetry. But here's where it gets interesting, because belief was half the magic. Medieval people genuinely thought these brews held power. So if a woman drank something and felt even slightly different, she might convince herself that she'd fallen under a spell. And then, whether by suggestion or genuine feeling, she'd start acting differently. She'd steal glances. She'd blush. She'd lean closer during church. The potion didn't create love. It created permission to feel what was already there. That's the secret, dark thrill of the love potion. It wasn't about chemistry. It was about lowering walls. A young couple might already be drawn to each other, but social rules kept them apart. The potion gave them an excuse. "It's not my fault," she could say. "He enchanted me." And he could nod solemnly, hiding his smile. The church, of course, hated this. They prosecuted potion makers as witches. They warned that love magic opened the door to demonic possession. And sometimes they were right, because desperate people did desperate things. One nobleman claimed he was seduced against his will because a woman wore enchanted rosemary. The court actually debated it for weeks. But the most tragic potions weren't the ones that failed. They were the ones that worked too well. A man gives a brew to a woman who has no interest in him. She drinks it, feels nothing, but pretends to be affected out of fear. He misreads her politeness as passion, and suddenly he's convinced they're destined to marry. She's trapped. He's deluded. The potion becomes a cage. That's the dark side of medieval romance, the belief that love could be forced, brewed, bought. It wasn't magic. It was desperation in a bottle. And yet, despite all the failure, people kept trying. Because when every other door is closed, when you can't speak, can't touch, can't even look too long, sometimes the only thing left is a prayer and a handful of herbs. The love potion wasn't about winning someone's heart. It was about refusing to accept that some things are beyond your control. And that, perhaps, is the most human impulse of all.